I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to go hiking alone that summer. I was 27 at the time, living in the small town of Clarksville, Arkansas. Life felt too predictable and I craved something different. I had a couple of days off from work, so I packed a bag, grabbed my old hiking boots, and drove out to a trail I'd never tried before. I had no particular plan, just a vague idea that I wanted to explore and clear my head. The trail was called Hollow Creek. It wasn't listed on most maps, and I'd only heard about it from a coworker who liked finding lesser-known spots to avoid crowds. I parked my car in a small gravel lot at the trailhead. The area felt remote, quiet, and peaceful. It was exactly what I wanted. The weather was perfect for hiking, warm but not too hot, with a slight breeze to keep the bugs away. I threw my backpack over my shoulder and started down the trail. The forest was dense, with towering pines and oak trees that let just enough sunlight filter through to create a golden glow. The trail wasn't well maintained, which added to the sense of adventure. I felt like I had stepped into a forgotten corner of the world, far away from the stress of my daily routine. About an hour into the hike, I noticed that the trail seemed to split into two paths. One was slightly overgrown, with weeds and branches blocking parts of it. The other looked more traveled, though not by much. I hesitated for a moment before choosing the overgrown path. I told myself I wanted to explore, and the less traveled trail seemed more intriguing. The path wound deeper into the forest, and I could feel the air getting cooler the further I went. It was quiet, so quiet that the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and leaves seemed almost too loud. I occasionally heard birds or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but it was otherwise still. After about 30 minutes, I noticed something unusual: the remains of an old wooden fence running along the edge of the trail. It was barely standing, with posts leaning at odd angles and large gaps where the wood had rotted away. Curious, I followed the fence for a while until I saw what it had once surrounded. There, hidden among the trees, was a small, weathered cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof sagged in the middle, the windows were either broken or boarded up, and the front door hung slightly open. Something about the cabin felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself it was just an old building, abandoned like so many others in the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to take a closer look. I don't know why. I think I was just curious. The fence and the cabin didn't seem to belong to anyone anymore, and part of me wanted to see what was inside. I stepped over the broken fence and approached the cabin. The ground around it was littered with debris: rusted tools, empty tin cans, and scraps of wood. It looked like whoever had lived here had left in a hurry, or maybe they just didn't care about cleaning up before abandoning it. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. The air felt heavier here, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. I pushed the door open slowly, and it creaked loudly in protest. The inside was dark, even though it was still daylight outside. I used the flashlight on my phone to look around. The cabin had only one room, with a dirt floor and walls covered in peeling wallpaper. There was an old wood-burning stove in the corner, a table with one chair, and a cot with a moldy mattress. The place smelled like damp earth and decay. What struck me most was how untouched everything seemed. It was as if the person who lived here had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. A pair of muddy boots sat by the door, and there was a cup on the table, half filled with some dark, dried-up liquid. I felt like I was intruding on someone's private space, even though it was clear no one had been here for years. As I moved the flashlight around, I noticed something strange scratched into the walls. At first, I thought it was just damage from age or animals, but when I looked closer, I realized they were words, names, dates, and short phrases. Most of it didn't make sense, but one phrase caught my eye: "Don't stay after dark." It was scratched deep into the wood, as if someone had written it in a hurry. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just an old warning, probably left by someone who believed in superstitions. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided it was time to leave. But as I turned to go, I heard something outside, a faint rustling, like someone walking through the leaves. I froze, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just an animal. After all, I was in the middle of the forest. But when I stepped back outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, bare footprints, leading from the edge of the trees to the cabin. They weren't there when I arrived. I scanned the forest, my heart pounding. The trees were dense, and the shadows made it hard to see far. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure standing just inside the tree line. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was wearing a dirty dress, and her hair hung in tangled clumps around her face. She was too far away for me to see clearly, but something about her posture was wrong. She stood completely still, facing me. I didn't wait to find out what she wanted. I turned and started back toward the trail as quickly as I could without running. My mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why was she out here? And why hadn't I heard her approach? As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woman didn't follow me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closer together. I realized I had made a mistake by coming here alone. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I felt a wave of relief. But as I climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed something on my windshield. It was a single muddy handprint, smeared across the glass. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and I knew it wasn't mine. I drove away as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened that day. I've told myself it was just a squatter living in the cabin, or maybe a local trying to scare off trespassers. But deep down, I'm not so sure. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about that woman and the way she stood so still, watching me. And every time I wake up, I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far into the woods. I spent a winter alone in a small cabin tucked deep in the Rocky Mountains, somewhere near the Colorado-Wyoming border. It was 2014, and I had just turned 34. I wasn't really the outdoorsy type, but I had been looking for a break from my job as a patrol officer in a Denver suburb. The idea of spending a month in solitude, surrounded by snow-covered forests, seemed like the kind of peace I needed. The cabin wasn't luxurious, but it had what I required: running water, a wood stove, and a generator for power. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest town, along an old dirt road that cut through the forest. The only other structures nearby were some abandoned ranger stations and a few hunting cabins scattered across the area. The first week was uneventful. I'd wake up early, chop wood, and sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the snow pile up higher every day. Occasionally, I'd go for short hikes or read one of the novels I'd brought with me. Nights were quiet except for the wind whistling through the trees. It was isolation, but the good kind. By the second week, the weather turned harsh. A heavy snowstorm hit the area, blocking the dirt road completely. I knew I'd have to wait it out before I could get to town for supplies, but I had enough food and firewood to last a few weeks if necessary. That was the beauty of planning ahead. But something happened during that storm that changed everything. It was around midnight, and I was sitting by the fire, listening to the wood crackle. The cabin was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the flames. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a sharp crunching sound, like boots breaking through fresh snow. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was walking around the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. The wind howled outside, making it hard to pinpoint the exact direction of the noise. My gun, A Glock 19 I carried off duty was in the bedroom. I stood up slowly, careful not to make any noise, and moved toward the hallway. The floor creaked under my weight, and I winced, hoping whoever was out there hadn't heard it. Reaching the bedroom, I grabbed the gun from the nightstand and clicked off the safety. My heart was pounding now, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. I moved back to the main room, keeping the weapon aimed at the front door. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The only sound was the wind and the faint rustling of tree branches outside. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. 3 light taps on the wooden door. I stared at the door, gripping the gun tighter. There was no way anyone should have been out there. Not in this weather, not this far from civilization. Another knock, louder this time. I didn't respond. Whoever was out there didn't call out, didn't say anything. Just another 3 knocks, insistent and deliberate. I stayed where I was, gun aimed, trying to think. Was it someone in trouble? A stranded hiker? But why wouldn't they call out for help? And why now, in the middle of a blizzard? My instincts told me not to trust this. The knocking stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence again. Then I heard the sound of footsteps retreating, moving away from the cabin. I crept to the window, careful not to let myself be seen, and peeked outside. The snow was blowing sideways, making it hard to see much, but I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadowy figure disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up by the fire, gun in hand, listening for any sound. The storm finally eased up by morning, but I felt no relief. When the sun came up, I stepped outside to check for tracks. Sure enough, there were footprints leading from the forest to my cabin and back again. Whoever it was had come from the north, where the abandoned ranger stations were located. I decided to investigate. It wasn't the smartest move, but curiosity and my training got the better of me. I put on my boots, layered up against the cold, and grabbed a flashlight and my gun. Following the tracks wasn't easy. The wind had blown snow over parts of the trail. Still, I managed to piece together a path that led deeper into the woods. About a mile from the cabin, I found something strange. A campsite buried under snow. There was a small, torn-up tent, a burned-out fire pit, and some scattered belongings. The sight sent a chill down my spine. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. There were cans of food, a flashlight with dead batteries, and even a half-frozen sleeping bag. What stood out most was a backpack. Inside, I found something I wasn't expecting. A roll of duct tape, zip ties, and a large hunting knife. This wasn't just some stranded camper. These were the tools of someone who had bad intentions. I rushed back to the cabin, my nerves on edge. By the time I got there, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The light was fading fast, and I didn't want to be caught outside in the dark. I locked the door, bolted it, and pushed a chair under the handle for good measure. Then I waited. The next 2 nights were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. I started sleeping with the Glock under my pillow, barely getting any rest. I considered hiking back to town, but the road was still impassable, and I didn't want to risk getting stranded in the forest with whoever was out there. On the 3rd night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I stayed in the bedroom this time, crouched in the corner with my gun aimed at the door. The footsteps stopped, and I waited, heart racing. Minutes felt like hours. Then, a loud crash shattered the silence. The sound came from the back of the cabin, where the kitchen was. I rushed to the doorway and saw the back window had been smashed open. Snow was blowing in, and I could feel the cold seeping into the room. Whoever it was had made their move. I didn't wait. I shouted a warning, knowing full well they wouldn't listen, and fired a single shot into the wall near the window. The sound echoed through the cabin, deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment, there was silence again, but then I heard rapid footsteps retreating into the woods. I spent the rest of the night on edge, expecting them to come back, but they didn't. By morning, the storm had finally let up enough for me to make the trek back to town. I packed up what I could, left the rest behind, and started walking. It took me nearly 6 hours to reach the main road, where a snowplow driver finally picked me up. I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office, but there wasn't much they could do. They checked the campsite I'd found, but didn't find any clues about who the person might have been. They figured it was probably someone hiding out in the woods, trying to avoid the law. But I knew better. Whoever it was, they weren't just trying to survive, they were hunting. To this day, I can't go camping or stay in a remote cabin without thinking about that night. The sound of footsteps in the snow still haunts me, and I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted in a place where I thought I'd be safe. It was the summer of 2015 when I found myself roped into a trip I wasn't entirely comfortable with. My sister, Erin, had convinced me to join her and her best friend, Casey, for a weekend getaway at Casey's mom's cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 19 at the time, a bit of a homebody, and not the biggest fan of remote places. Erin, though, was always dragging me into situations that pushed me out of my comfort zone. Casey had recently gotten her driver's license, and she was eager to show off her newfound independence by taking us to her mom's place. Her mom rarely used the cabin anymore, but it was fully stocked with essentials and still in decent shape. The idea was simple: a weekend away from the city, no parents, no responsibilities, just the three of us hanging out, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. The cabin was about 3 hours from our town, tucked away in a heavily forested area near a small, isolated lake. It sounded quaint on paper, but the more Casey and Erin described it, the more uneasy I felt. Casey talked about how there was no cell service for miles and how the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. She made it sound like an adventure, but to me, it sounded like a recipe for trouble. Still, Erin was insistent, and I didn't want to be the boring sister who ruined the fun. We left early on a Friday morning, piling into Casey's slightly beat-up sedan. The car was stuffed with snacks, sleeping bags, and everything we thought we'd need for 2 nights. As we drove, the city gave way to endless stretches of farmland, and then to dense forests. The paved roads eventually turned into gravel, and the gravel into dirt. By the time we reached the cabin, it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. The cabin itself was small and rustic, but cozy. It had a single main room with a kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, and a couch that pulled out into a bed. There was one small bedroom with a creaky twin bed and a tiny bathroom with an old, finicky toilet. Outside, there was a fire pit surrounded by a few log stools and a path that led down to the lake. It was exactly what you'd picture when you think of a secluded cabin in the woods. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, made lunch, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. The lake was beautiful but eerily still, and the surrounding woods were so thick that sunlight barely broke through the canopy. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I told myself it was just my nerves. After all, I wasn't used to being in such an isolated place. That night, we built a fire and roasted marshmallows. Casey and Erin were laughing and swapping stories, but I couldn't relax. The woods felt too quiet. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A twig snapping, leaves rustling. But whenever I looked around, I saw nothing. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to seem paranoid. We went to bed around midnight, with Erin and Casey sharing the pull-out couch and me taking the twin bed in the small bedroom. I left the door slightly ajar, hoping it would make me feel less cut off. The silence was oppressive, and every creak of the old cabin made my heart race. Eventually, Exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that froze me in place. It was faint but distinct, the sound of someone walking outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard it again, this time closer to the front door. My first thought was that it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the weight of the steps didn't match. They were too heavy, too measured. My mind raced as I considered waking Aaron and Casey, but I didn't want to panic them if it turned out to be nothing. I lay there, heart pounding, as the footsteps circled the cabin. Whoever or whatever it was didn't try to open the door or peek through the windows. They just walked, slow and steady, around and around. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded, and I heard nothing but the deafening silence of the woods. The next morning, I didn't mention what I'd heard. Aaron and Casey were in high spirits, and I didn't want to ruin the mood. But as we ate breakfast, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Human footprints. They were faint, but they were there, circling the cabin just as I'd heard the night before. I pointed them out to Casey and Aaron, trying to sound casual. Casey shrugged it off, saying it was probably from a hiker passing through. Aaron agreed, but I could tell she was uneasy. We decided to spend the day hiking and swimming, trying to shake off the weirdness of the morning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were more deliberate, stopping at the windows and the door. My pulse raced as I heard the faint sound of the door handle rattling. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was glued shut. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching the blanket like it could somehow protect me. The rattling stopped, and the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning came, I told Aaron and Casey what I'd heard. Casey looked concerned but tried to brush it off, saying it was probably an animal. Aaron didn't say much, but I could tell she was spooked. We decided to cut the trip short and head back home that afternoon. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods felt too quiet again, and every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. We loaded up the car and started the long drive back. About an hour into the drive, Casey suddenly slammed on the brakes. In the middle of the dirt road was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly on top of each other. It hadn't been there when we drove in. We didn't say a word as Casey steered the car around the rocks and sped down the road. None of us looked back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with us. I don't know if they were just trying to scare us or if they had something more sinister in mind. But I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in a remote cabin again. The rain started falling in sheets as I pulled up to the cabin that night. It was deep in the woods, far away from anything resembling civilization. The gravel road leading to it had turned to mud, and my tires skidded as I parked. It wasn't my cabin. It belonged to a friend of a friend who'd offered it for a weekend getaway. I thought a quiet weekend away from everything would help clear my head, but as soon as I stepped out of the car, I felt a knot in my stomach. Something about the place didn't sit right. The cabin was an old one, built sometime in the 1940s or earlier. The wood was dark, weathered by decades of storms. The windows were small, with warped glass that distorted the view inside. I unlocked the door with the key I'd been given, and it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The interior smelled musty, like damp wood and mildew. The furniture looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Scratchy plaid couches, a coffee table with water stains, and a wood stove in the corner. I flicked the light switch, and a single bulb in the center of the room buzzed to life, casting a dim yellow glow. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and only the barest cell service. The isolation was part of the appeal at first. I'd been craving silence, a chance to unwind without distractions. Now, though, the silence felt oppressive. The rain hammered against the roof as I unpacked my bag. I'd brought enough food for a couple of days. Simple stuff like canned soup and bread, and a book I'd been meaning to finish. I lit a fire in the stove to chase away the damp chill, then sat on the couch with my book. For the first hour, everything was fine. The sound of rain and crackling fire was almost soothing. Then I heard the first sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling outside. At first, I told myself it was the wind or maybe an animal. The cabin was in the middle of the woods, after all. I kept reading, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to the windows, though I couldn't see much beyond the warped glass and the rain pouring down outside. The noise came again, louder this time, a scraping sound, like something brushing against the wall. I set my book down and stood up, my heart beating a little faster. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room. I went to the window and peered out, but it was too dark to see anything. Probably a branch, I muttered under my breath, trying to reassure myself. I went back to the couch, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I kept glancing at the windows, straining to hear over the rain. Then came the thud. It was sharp, distinct, and it came from the back of the cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't a sound the wind could make. It was deliberate, heavy, like someone or something had hit the wall. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and turned it on. The beam cut through the gloom as I made my way to the back door. I debated whether to go outside, but my instincts told me to stay put. I locked the door instead and double-checked the front door, too. The cabin didn't have much in the way of security, just simple locks on flimsy wooden doors. The rain was still pouring, masking any subtle sounds from outside. I sat back down, but this time I couldn't relax. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind, made me jump. I told myself it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on me, but deep down, I didn't believe it. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Footsteps, not inside but on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, the kind a person would make if they were trying not to be heard. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and stood by the door, listening. The steps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain. Then, a loud bang as something hit the front door. I almost dropped the knife. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on it. "Who's there?" I finally shouted, but the sound of my own voice didn't make me feel any better. There was no response, just another bang, this time on the side of the cabin. It felt like whoever or whatever was outside was testing the place, looking for a way in. I turned off the flashlight, hoping the darkness inside would hide me. I crouched by the couch, knife in hand, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The banging stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps moving around the cabin. They were slow and steady, circling the building. For what felt like hours, I stayed frozen in place. The rain continued, and the footsteps eventually faded into the distance. I didn't dare move until the sun started to rise, casting a weak gray light through the windows. When I finally worked up the courage to go outside, I saw muddy footprints all around the cabin. They were human, barefoot, but large, like a grown man's. My car, thankfully, was untouched. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the car, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the safety of a crowded diner. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that cabin again. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the storm, and it knew I was inside. I was 28 when I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains for a week. It was early September 2019, and I'd been feeling burned out from work. The idea of disconnecting from the world, away from emails and notifications, sounded like paradise. I found a cabin online, a small, rustic place nestled deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The pictures showed a cozy wooden structure with a stone fireplace, surrounded by dense trees and wildflowers. It seemed perfect. The drive out there was uneventful. I had stocked up on food, water, and some firewood, not wanting to make unnecessary trips back to town. The road leading to the cabin was gravel and dirt, winding through thick forests that blocked out most of the sunlight. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined, but charming. There was a main room with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a couch. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and bathroom. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Felt peaceful. I spent the first evening unpacking and settling in. I lit a fire, cooked some canned soup, and sat by the hearth, reading a book. The quiet was soothing, and I felt the tension of city life slowly melt away. By the time I went to bed, I was feeling optimistic about the week ahead. The next morning, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and set out with no particular destination in mind. The forest was dense, with towering pines and patches of ferns and moss. The air was cool, and the ground was soft beneath my boots. I followed a deer trail that wound through the trees, enjoying the solitude and the occasional burst of birdsong. After about an hour, I stumbled upon a clearing. It wasn't large, maybe 30 feet across, but something about it felt off. The trees surrounding the clearing were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The grass was sparse, and the soil looked dry and cracked, unlike the lush greenery I had seen elsewhere. In the center of the clearing was a small mound of rocks, like a cairn. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the mound, noticing how the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. The rocks were smooth and stacked neatly, too deliberate to be natural. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out and moving one of the stones. Underneath, I found what I initially thought was a rock, but as I brushed away the dirt, I realized it was a human skull. The sight made my stomach churn. It was old, yellowed, and cracked in places, but unmistakably human. I quickly replaced the rock and stepped back, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I report it? Who would I even call? This place was so remote, and the skull looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. I decided to head back to the cabin and think it over. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest, which had felt so alive earlier, now seemed silent and still, as if holding its breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump, and I kept imagining someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. When dawn finally came, I felt drained but determined to figure out what to do next. I spent the morning searching online for any information about the area. There wasn't much, just a few vague mentions of logging camps and old mining operations from the 1800s. No records of anything unusual or any missing persons that might explain the skull. I considered hiking back to the clearing to take pictures, but the thought made my skin crawl. Instead, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I chopped some firewood, read for a while, and tried to distract myself. But as the day wore on, I began to notice strange things. Small things at first. A rusted nail lying on the porch that I was sure hadn't been there before. The kitchen window, which I distinctly remembered closing, was now open. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, though I hadn't lit the fireplace. By evening, I was on edge. I double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, and kept a heavy flashlight within arm's reach. As I sat by the fire, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the shutters. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I felt like I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke up to find footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were large, booted prints, leading from the edge of the forest to my front porch. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen or heard anyone, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. What was I supposed to do? Stay and hope whoever it was didn't come back? Leave and risk running into them in the woods? I spent the day barricading the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture in front of the doors and stacked firewood against the windows. I kept a knife from the kitchen tucked into my belt, though I doubted it would do much good. The hours dragged by, each one heavier with dread than the last. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. My blood ran cold. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. Then silence. I stayed where I was, clutching the knife until dawn. When daylight came, I cautiously opened the door. The footprints were back, leading away from the cabin this time, deeper into the forest. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. I needed to know who or what was out there. The trail led me back to the clearing with the cairn. The rocks had been disturbed, scattered across the ground. The skull was gone. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The forest was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. My heart pounded as I realized I needed to leave. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to find out. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my bag, and jumped into my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. As I drove, I kept expecting to see someone or something in the rearview mirror, but the road remained empty. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a rush of relief. The cabin was far behind me, but the memories of those 5 days would stay with me forever. I never went back to the mountains, and I never told anyone about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that soft, deliberate knock in my dreams. And when I wake up, I always check the door. I never thought I'd spend that weekend alone in the woods, but life has a way of putting you in situations you don't expect. It was early November 2019, and the weather had just begun to turn cold. I'd planned to spend the weekend with my girlfriend, Sarah, in a cabin we rented near the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. It wasn't luxurious, but it had charm. A small, 2-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a squeaky bed, and a screened-in porch that overlooked the dense woods surrounding the property. Sarah had to cancel at the last minute because of work, but I decided to go anyway. I'd been stressed out for weeks and thought some time away from the city would do me good. I packed light, just some clothes, a book, and a few groceries. I arrived on Friday afternoon, the sun already hanging low in the sky. The dirt road leading to the cabin was bumpy and overgrown, making my little car struggle. I parked near the cabin and took in the silence. No cars, no voices, no sounds of the city. Just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a bird. The cabin itself looked a bit worn, but it was as I remembered from the photos. A small structure with faded green paint and a slanted tin roof, surrounded by towering trees. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like damp wood and old stone, but it was cozy. The living area had a small couch, the wood stove, and a tiny kitchenette. A short hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. There wasn't much to it, but it felt like a good place to unwind. After unloading my stuff, I chopped some kindling from the woodpile out back and got a fire going in the stove. By the time the cabin had warmed up, it was dark outside, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I made a simple dinner, just pasta and canned sauce, and settled on the couch with my book. The quiet was comforting at first, a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. But as the hours dragged on, the stillness began to feel oppressive. Every creak of the old cabin and every gust of wind outside seemed louder, sharper. I brushed it off, telling myself I just wasn't used to the isolation. By 11 p.m., I was tired and decided to head to bed. The bedroom was small, just a double bed with an old quilt and a single bedside table. I left the wood stove burning in the main room, hoping it would keep the chill away, and crawled under the covers. The bed was uncomfortable, the mattress sagging in the middle, but I was too tired to care. I fell asleep quickly, the silence finally lulling me into rest. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, my heart pounding for no apparent reason. Took me a moment to remember where I was. The room was pitch black, but I could hear the faint crackle of the dying fire in the stove. My throat felt dry, so I decided to get up and grab some water. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed how cold the air had become. The fire must have burned out more than I thought. I filled a glass from the kitchen sink, drinking it slowly while staring out the small window above the counter. The woods were a wall of darkness, but something about the way the trees swayed in the wind made me feel uneasy. I told myself I was just overthinking things. I turned off the kitchen light and headed back to bed. That's when I noticed it, the faintest sound, coming from somewhere outside. It was hard to describe. Not quite footsteps, but not the usual rustling of animals either. It was a regular stopping and starting again, like someone or something was moving cautiously. I stood there for a moment, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I peered out the bedroom window, but the night was too dark to see anything. Just the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or some other wildlife. I climbed back into bed, pulling the quilt up to my chin, but sleep didn't come easily. My ears were tuned to every sound, every creak of the cabin and every gust of wind outside. Morning came slowly. The weak sunlight barely filtered through the trees, but I felt a bit better seeing it. I spent the day trying to relax, reading, going for a short hike, even sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. But that unease from the night lingered. It was the kind of feeling you can't quite explain, like being watched. The woods, once serene, now felt claustrophobic. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the tree line. As the afternoon wore on, clouds rolled in, and the temperature dropped again. By the time I made dinner, it had started to drizzle. I ate quickly and cleaned up, deciding to turn in early. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before heading to bed. The rain picked up as the night wore on, tapping against the roof and windows. The sound was almost comforting, a steady rhythm that drowned out the creaks and groans of the old cabin. But then I heard it again, that strange noise from the night before. This time it was louder, closer. I froze in bed, straining to make sense of it. It sounded like something or someone moving around the cabin, the crunch of wet leaves and the snap of twigs. My heart raced as I debated what to do. I didn't have any weapons, just a small pocket knife in my bag. I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service this deep in the woods. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but all I could hear was the rain. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop, Just outside the cabin, near the back door, was a series of muddy footprints. They were human, barefoot no less, and they circled the cabin before disappearing into the woods. I felt a wave of fear and anger. Who the hell would be wandering around out here in the middle of the night, barefoot in the cold rain? I spent the day on edge, checking the windows and doors every hour, but nothing else happened. By nightfall, the rain had stopped, and the woods were eerily quiet again. I debated packing up and leaving, but the thought of driving those rough, winding roads in the dark didn't seem much safer. I decided to stick it out for one more night. That final night was the worst. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the pocket knife from my bag and crept into the hallway. The rattling stopped, but I could hear faint, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time, circling the cabin again. I stayed frozen in the hallway, knife clutched tightly in my hand, until the sounds finally faded away. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as there was enough light, I threw my stuff into the car and left. I didn't bother cleaning up or locking the cabin. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt a chill run down my spine. Standing at the edge of the woods was a figure, tall, motionless, watching me. I didn't stop to get a better look. I pressed the gas pedal and didn't look back. I never found out who or what it was, and I have no plans to go back. That weekend was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into something I still can't fully explain. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just an animal, and I'll never forget the way it felt to be watched, even when I thought I was alone. It started with a search for solitude. I had grown tired of the constant noise and pressure of the city. The year was 1997, and I was 29, working a dull office job in Columbus, Ohio. I needed a break, a chance to breathe somewhere far removed from my daily grind. After some research, I found an old cabin listed for rent deep in the Appalachian Mountains, near a small, forgotten town called Tuckerville, West Virginia. The cabin was cheap, secluded, and surrounded by miles of wilderness. It seemed like the perfect getaway. The drive to the cabin was long but scenic. As the hours passed, the road narrowed, and the houses became fewer and farther between. By the time I reached Tuckerville, it felt like I had stepped back in time. The town was barely a dot on the map, with a general store, a diner, and a post office. I stopped briefly to pick up some supplies and noticed how the locals stared at me. Not in a hostile way, but with the kind of curiosity reserved for outsiders. The last stretch of the journey was a dirt road that wound through dense woods. My car's tires kicked up a cloud of dust as I navigated the twists and turns, eventually arriving at the cabin. It was small, with weathered wooden walls and a tin roof, sitting on the edge of a clearing. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I had been looking for. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking the trails, reading on the porch, and enjoying the quiet. At night, the darkness was absolute, with no streetlights or nearby houses to cast even a faint glow. I had brought a flashlight and some candles, which added to the cabin's rustic charm. On the fourth day, I decided to explore the area more thoroughly. A dirt path behind the cabin led into the woods, and I followed it for about an hour until I came across something unexpected. A small, overgrown graveyard. It was surrounded by a rusty iron fence, with a wooden gate that hung off its hinges. The headstones were weathered and tilted, their inscriptions barely legible. Some dated back to the late 1800s, while others were more recent, the newest one from the 1970s. There was something unsettling about the place. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around it, blocking out the sunlight, or the silence that replaced the usual forest sounds when I stepped inside. Still, I chalked it up to my imagination and curiosity. I spent some time examining the headstones, wondering about the lives of the people buried there. After about 20 minutes, I decided to head back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The cabin felt different, almost too quiet. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see something or someone moving in the shadows. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old graveyard, nothing more. The next day, I woke early and tried to shake off the previous night's anxiety. I spent most of the day chopping firewood and fishing in a nearby stream. By the time evening rolled around, I felt more like myself. I lit a fire in the cabin's small fireplace and settled in with a book. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like the sound of branches snapping underfoot. I froze, listening intently. The noise grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was moving through the woods toward the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, but the beam revealed nothing but trees. For the next hour, I sat in silence, every muscle in my body tense. The sounds eventually stopped, but the sense of unease lingered. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal and finally went to bed, though I barely slept. The following day, I decided to avoid the graveyard and stick close to the cabin. I spent the morning on the porch, keeping an eye on the woods. In the afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for signs of anything unusual, footprints, broken branches, anything to explain the noises from the night before. I found nothing. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were closer, circling the cabin. I locked the doors and windows, my heart pounding. I felt trapped, surrounded by an unseen presence. Around 2 a.m., the noises stopped again, leaving me in an eerie silence that was somehow worse. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care if I had paid for the entire week. I couldn't stay there another night. As I packed, I noticed something chilling. A set of footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They were large, unmistakably human, and they led from the woods to the cabin's rear window. I left the cabin within the hour, my hands trembling as I loaded my car. The drive back to Tuckerville felt like an eternity. When I reached the town, I stopped at the general store to return the cabin key. The old man behind the counter looked at me with a knowing expression. "You didn't last long," he said. I didn't respond. I didn't want to know what he meant. I drove straight back to Columbus, my mind racing the entire way. Weeks later, I did some research on Tuckerville and the surrounding area. I learned that the graveyard I had stumbled upon was part of an old homestead that had been abandoned in the early 1900s. There were rumors about the land being cursed, about people disappearing in the woods and never being found. I still don't know what I heard or saw during my time at the cabin. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of those woods, of the graveyard, and the heavy silence that surrounded me. And when I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, followed me home.